really an honor to engage with this project, to engage with this book, and to try to think seriously about the kind of knowledge that visual representations like photographs produce. So what I want to do in this presentation is to think about the different kinds of claims that we can make for photographs and stories and kinds of narratives and anecdotes and forms of reporting that we've been talking a lot about earlier on. Text produces a certain kind of knowledge and it deals with time and sequentiality and narrative in a very particular way. Photographs, I think, do something very, very different. And so I want to open up questions about the differences, really, between the kinds of knowledge that photographic languages produce and the kinds of questions that they ask us to pose and to address. And one of the powerful things about this book, in terms of its juxtapositions, is that it actually really invites us to think about the different kinds of claims of these different forms of representation. So interestingly, right at the front of the book, the photographer, Rudolf van Wyk, suggests that photography has a certain kind of power to provide nuance to a story. And I find this an interesting proposition coming from a photographer himself, because I would want to question that to some extent. Yes, photography might provide nuance to a story, but that presupposes a kind of illustrational relationship between the photograph and the story, which I think we might want to open up to question. Photographs, it seems to me, we require different things of photographs, and they have very, very different histories. They come freighted with very particular histories and mediations, which are always in place when we look at photographs. And this is particularly the case with portrait and portrait photography, which is what we're really looking at in this book. So the minute that you have portraiture, and I'm not talking about self-portraiture, I'm talking about portraiture, you're dealing with a triangulation of a relationship, in the sense that you have the subject, you have the photographer, and you have the viewer. And in that encounter of a triangulation, there is the capacity and the potentiality for different kind of meaning to be constructed. So that already opens up a whole series of mediations and questions that I think we might want to address. And I'm going to look at individual photographs in a minute to think about that. But the portrait encounter, the photographic encounter, is always an encounter of exchange. And it's one in which certain kinds of power relations might or might not be already in place. So you have that, but you also have the mediations of the history of figural photography, photography that represents the body, and it comes freighted with all kinds of institutional and discursive apparatus. So particularly with representations of people, we think of mugshots, we think of surveillance, we think of anthropometry and anthropology, we think of ethnographic representation, we think of the way in which photograph works as a form of policing identity within systems of power and relations of power. And it's very, very difficult to escape from some of that baggage, in a way, when you look at representations of people, which is why questions around the violence of the photographic encounter are always and often put into place. The fact that we talk about shooting a photograph comes with the kind of linguistic baggage, which is interesting. I mean, a camera is not a gun, but often the language that circulates around photography comes already freighted with that. And there are questions around the power relationships of who has the camera, who is photographed, what happens in that transaction, and what happens to the photograph subsequently. So it's very, very difficult, as I say, to think about photography without these technologies, these histories, and these mediations. This is not to say that I'm thinking that these photographs in this book are symptomatic of that, but I think it's very difficult for those of us who work in visual histories and photographic histories not always to be thinking about the relationship between those histories and the kinds of photographic encounters that are staged for us within particular bodies of work. So these photographs are heavily mediated. They're mediated, as I say, by history, but they're also mediated by the kinds of textual relationship, the cover, the story, the context, and the situation in which we encounter them here. And I think that that's also important, because one of the crucial things about photographs and photographic historians and theorists often like to talk about this, is that no photograph has any essential meaning that will stay the same in a different situation. Photographs are made to be reproduced, circulated, repurposed, and remediated. And each time, if I show you this photograph in this book, I'm sorry the light isn't great, but you can look at the photographs in detail afterwards in the book. If I show it to you in this context, mediated by the conversation, the tensions, the anxieties that we have already experienced as a group this morning, and that we've articulated this morning, with me in my position sitting talking about them, we are experiencing this photograph in one way and in one situation, and between the covers of this book. If it were to appear in a magazine, in a tourist brochure on the Cape Flats, going back to this morning's lecture, each mediation allows a different kind of reading. So I think that that's also really, really important. So what kinds of stories then can photographs tell would be one of the questions that I would like to ask. When we think about narratives and the kinds of stories that are so beautifully distilled in this book, they're usually sequential. They have a sense that there is some kind of a structural, temporal narrative where a person is recounting an experience that happened to them in the past. They're doing it from the vantage point of the present. And this sequential narration of time is actually essential to the story. Photographs do not deal with time in that way. That's not a temporal medium. It's a spatial medium in which you look at the photograph and it's as if everything appears at once. You have to, in a sense, decode what is in front of you in a kind of spatial way of reading, which is not to say that time cannot be factored into photographs. And one of the reasons why photographs are used by trauma theorists so much is because photographs are often seen to be the medium in which the veiled ghosts of the past inadvertently, unconsciously, can sometimes appear to be staged, often without the photographer or the sitter even being aware that that dynamic is there. So things are not always, goes back to your point earlier about the optical unconscious, or one of you mentioned the optical unconscious. Photographs often tell us stuff that we do not know is there. It's out of the control sometimes of the teller and of the subject, because the information that is spatially arrayed within the language of photography is not narrated in that kind of sequential way. So that's a thing that I think is very interesting, and together we might want to think about what these photographs tell us that sometimes can go against the grain of the intentional remit of the project and even the thrust of the story of the narrator. So yes, going back to what Pumla was saying earlier, the photographs intend to provide a dignity, an agency, a platform for people to narrate themselves. But photographs can, as I say, bequeath information which is unbeknown to the teller. And I think that's one of the things that's very rich and very interesting, and which provides us with the possibility for endless reading and rereading of the photographic mise-en-scène, what is up there, what is presented to us in the photograph. So I think it's also interesting always to think about how photographs build, exceed, and go beyond what the immediate mediation wants us to glean from them. How does photographic meaning escape? Would be one of the questions I would want to pose. So just recapping quickly, on the one hand then you have this whole baggage, a kind of Foucauldian notion of a panopticon, of a photographic eye, of a, if you want to call it a colonial gaze, a male gaze, a white gaze. There are all sorts of ways in which we can think about the tyranny of a certain kind of looking that comes from certain kinds of power structures, and photography, that we can all find photographs that seem very much to be understood within those disciplinary and historical and structural and institutional frameworks. But at the same time, particularly within portrait encounters, and portraiture is very interesting because of the way in which it can escape the anthropometric, the anthropological, the ethnographic, the classificatory. When we talk about portraiture, those of us who are involved in art history or in visual history, one assumes that a mugshot is not a portrait. One assumes that a shot of an ethnographic of a certain kind of native type, for example, we all know those kinds of photographs, those are not portraits. Because portraits are not just representations of people. Portraits, as in terms of the way in which we understand them, entail the encounter with the sentient subjectivity of somebody who can be known to us through the language of photography. So others, those classificatory protocols deal with types. The Zulu warrior, the, I don't know, femme fatale, whatever. But a portrait, and this is where I think it becomes a very tricky navigation in photography, because these boundaries are often not so easy to police. And it can be contested. One person's type can be another person's portrait. So when does something become a portrait? In my language, it becomes a portrait when it seems to represent the sentient subjectivity of a like human. Not an othered, objectified, reified type. There we're into something different. So one of the things that I think is very extraordinary about this book is that we are in the realm of portraiture. We are not in the realm of classificatory types and but again, we can open these sorts of things up for discussion. And insofar as we're in the realm of portraiture, you might say that all photographs, even classificatory mugshots, etc., provide the opportunity for something to exceed the remit of the intention of the project. I mean, some explorer might have gone to some environment intending to classify the qualities of this or that community, but something in the background of the photograph, something in the way that person holds their position, something in the clothing that they wear undermines that. So there is always the possibility that photographic meaning can escape the classificatory gaze that might have been there at its inception. And often the way in which these are mediated, you see the way photographs can be repurposed. So for example, photographs that you might regard as extremely objectifying, racializing or racist imagery, for example of Australian Aboriginal communities, have become repurposed and reused by the ancestors of those very communities who say those are the only photographs left of my grandfather. I take that photograph. I take it away from your classificatory rhetoric and discourse, and I reinterpret it differently, I frame it differently, I live with it differently. So that, I think, is a really, really crucial thing. It's not a fixed process. It's very much an open process. So I wanted to just take the opportunity, and I'm going to be really interested to see how you all respond to these photographs, because you will have different sorts of questions, I'm sure, to ask. If we look at a photograph like this one, and as I say, these are highly mediated, and this is where you go back to Oelofsen's point, are these illustrations of a story? Do they flesh out a story? Or do they exist as parallel, equivalent, equal modes of representation as the storytelling themselves? And I would want to opt for the latter, because I think what we need to do is to mine them for the things they can tell us, which sometimes the person's self-narration doesn't, for whatever reason. So in this one over here of Friederike, for example, those of you who haven't read the book, it's interesting, I just took out one sentence from it. I grew up in George on a white man's farm with an uncle of mine, just to, almost as an aide-memoir for myself, but just to reference something of the narrative that Grootboom gives us, which is basically how he was orphaned, he was neglected, he grew up on a farm, his parents didn't understand education, his community didn't understand education. His narrative is the narrative of a neglected child, who is still, as an older man, lives under the weight and under the spectre of that form of neglect, abuse, abandonment, and also a kind of blind obedience to the protocols of apartheid, which he sees himself as very much the product of. But if you look at the photograph like this one, so here's a photograph taken, and I presume he's now a man in his 60s, or an older man. What does the photograph tell us? I would want to say that that story doesn't tell us. So I'm looking at a very nice image of it here. You're looking at a little faded one over there, unfortunately. But I think that there are things that are going on here that tell us about his current situation that are very interesting. So, for example, we can see the time of day. It's probably in the early afternoon because we can read the shadows. Shadows are very important signs in a photograph that help us to read a moment in which an encounter is happening, and it's a distillation of a moment rather than something that happens sequentially and over time. In this early afternoon, Friederike seats himself on a plastic chair on which he has put a cushion for his own comfort, and he inhabits that chair with a certain degree of ease, and I read it as a certain kind of comfort. Again, we might have many different readings, so bear with me as I do my own narrative. Because the other thing about photographs, I think, is that they're not so much illustrations of stories as prompts to storytelling. The photograph actually produces a narrative rather than illustrate an existing narrative, and we have to allow ourselves to use it to prompt ourselves to stories, and it depends on where we're reading from. So one of the things that I wanted to think about was a degree of self-care that I see in this photograph. And the degree of self-care is that this is a man who gives himself a cushion to sit on, and who sits in this chair. It might be a cheap plastic chair in a particular rather woebegone yard, who knows, but he sits in that chair with a fair degree of ease and comfort. The environment is stark. So the environment has these shadows. It's stark because nothing grows there. It is a yard, it is cemented over. But the shadows cast interesting patterns on the space. So we see that there is an iron door, a security door, that casts its own shadow on the wall behind. We see that there are bars on the window, so that this is an environment in which somebody has cared to protect themselves and needs to protect themselves against whatever is understood and experienced to be harm that can come from outside. We see wires hanging down the wall. We see connection to electricity. We see a television aerial. We see his clothes. We see, I don't know if you can, but there's a hole in his sock. So we can see a certain situation in which he is in. We see the kind of shirt, the checked shirt that he wears, as again a certain kind of self-care. All of these details, and photographs are extremely rich repositories of detail. They require time. You require time to live with the photographic image and to decode all these things. Now, I doubt that, that this was intentional in the terms of the way in which he represented or configured himself, but in the image that we have there, there's a huge amount that we can read from that speaks to a certain situation, a moment in history, a moment in time. That history is in the medium as well, because technologies of photography change. This is probably shot now on a digital camera. I don't know how it's reproduced. We haven't got the photographers here, unfortunately, but we could ask them that. But they come out of a very particular kind of a photographic encounter, and we can imagine where the photographer is. Is the photographer in that yard? How close is the photographer to the body of the person being photographed? What is happening within that triangulation that I described earlier, that encounter of ourselves, the photographer, etc. So it's not about anecdote, and it's not about temporal sequential narration. It's more really about this simultaneous, not sequential form of reading, inadvertent as well as overt meaning, often unintentional, often things that seem extraneous to the story that Friederike Grooteboom told, but nevertheless becomes a way of filling in the picture of a life lived now, in our time. So I think that this is, this is really interesting in the book in terms of the way in which we read these things. And there is a discourse around photographs, of course, that they provide us with certain kinds of truth and witness, and going back right to the origin of photography. You read 19th century accounts of photography. One of the reasons why people who were really interested in art didn't like photography was they thought it was an industrial, mimetic, rather banal medium that just told you the world as it was. In fact, the more we understand the language of photography right from the start, the more we understand how it is manipulated, how it can potentially tell untruths as well as truths. So photography can do all sorts of things. It can idealize, it can romanticize, it can sentimentalize. There are ways in which the affect that photographs produce is also open to being read. And I think we needn't just think of the photograph as a document, but we need to think of the photograph as a meaning-producing phenomenon. So let's take another example, and the story of Abeda Stoffberg has come up a few times today because it is, I think, one of the most powerful stories in the whole book. She is the person who lives her whole life with the guilt around the ball that went into the wife's only part of the railway carriage and led to her own father being beaten up brutally by the police. And she says that ball should not have rolled there. That was the sentence that I took away from her testimony, from her account, from her story. So I think that it's extremely powerful. But again, we have a number of different photographs. One, we have the incredibly powerful portrait. And here again, the way one reads faces is very interesting. And this is going away from the physiognomic protocols of the way in which photography was used in its early formation, where photographs of faces were used as evidence of mental capacity or of, proclivities, etc. If you had big ears, you were a prostitute, or if you had a high forehead, you were intelligent, or whatever. It sounds to us like a whole lot of absurd projection now. But there was the phrenological, so-called pseudosciences of the 19th century used photography very strongly, particularly photography of faces and people, in order to classify and organize knowledge of human difference and human particularity, and to put it into various schema. So when I talk about reading a face, I'm reading against the grain of that whole history of the uses of portraiture. And in this case, what I want to do is to read the wrinkles and the lines and the wear and tear of human experience on the face, which is extremely powerful and profound in a photograph like this, especially once we've read that story. And I think this is what is so interesting about what you have set up in the book, is that we are constantly pushed and pulled between this narrative freight of the stories and the particular physical evidence of the photographs, wanting to see the one reflected in the other, but at the same time knowing that they cannot be, and that they cannot be reduced one to the other, and that they exist in parallel lines. And I think that is a really productive and useful and interesting tension, and not one that one wants to, write out of what gets set up in the book. It's keeping those equal different systems of representation in dialogue with one another that is so absolutely fascinating. So we read her face, and the overriding, to me, theme of the whole book is around sadness and loss. And whether it is, we've talked about this already this morning, whether it's around loss of place or loss of home, or and not just loss because carelessness, but actually deprivation of the thing. So there's been a volitional, violent form of taking away something from someone, which produces almost irreparable loss in that person. And that we talked a little bit. In fact, I also wrote down Melancholia, also having read, of course, Paul Gilroy's Post-Colonial Melancholia, and thought quite a lot about melancholia in relation to this project. So it might be something we might want to come back to, because of course in classic psychoanalytic theory and literature, melancholia is seen as a sort of bad thing, or something you've got to get over to get to mourning and closure. And I was very taken by the idea that we might want to stay in the realm of melancholia and unfinished business as a productive space from which to think and speak, rather than as something we better get through in order to get to closure, and then to putative healing, whatever that is. So I think these are all sorts of questions that are really, really interesting that have come into the conversation and that we might bring into thinking about in relation to the visual as well. So I was struck by Abela Stoffberg's photograph also of herself in front of her own house, and the grass that grows, the socks that come out of her sandals, the full length of her tunic, the shape of the house behind her, the blueness of the sky. Those of us who live outside of this country now and live in London and long for the blueness of the sky, you know, you look at the blueness of that sky and you know what it is and where it comes from. So it's freighted with a kind of different, almost kind of longing, and for me, a kind of loss in a sense as well. So the photographs are freighted with all sorts of information and longing in very, very different kinds of ways, and that struck me as very interesting in an image like this. Or if we look at the story of Nicholas Meninzi. Now, we talked a little bit about him this morning. Trying to remember now the story. Oh, he was the one whose friend was shot, exactly, right next to him. And in a minute I'll show another photograph which he's lived always with the knowledge that this person, this was in 76, during the 76 riots, his friend was standing literally right alongside him when he was shot. So we read that story and we look at this photograph. But what strikes me with this photograph so crucially, and this is to do with the vantage point from which it's taken, are the hands. The face is very powerful. It's a strong and very, very contemplative face. You can see an inner life going on in that face, as you can in all these photographs, which is why I see them so much as portraits, because you get the sense of the inner life, the inner consciousness of the subject. But you look at this photograph, and it's, again, I don't think this is necessarily intentional, but where the camera person, the photographer, is standing, produces a kind of exaggeration of the hands, very, very near and close up. And the strength of the arm, the muscle of his right arm. And they look like hands which work. They look like hands that can make things, that can fabricate and that can build. This might be completely my projection, but they are very, very powerful. Hands that can make a life and hands that can build a world in some ways. So the pain, the suffering with which this man lives and which he articulates, and which is etched in his face as well, is also, to me, juxtaposed with a certain kind of strength, volitional strength, determination that comes from the way that those hands appear close to us within the image. This one, Ridwan Sali's one, interested me a lot because it's one of the few portraits where you look at the face askance. You don't look on, you do not encounter the eyes, you don't look into this person's inner mind. Instead, you look at the side of the face, you look at the light on the side of the face, you read the little kapi on the head, and that as an extremely powerful physical silhouette against the abstracted light of this environment, which is very, very hard to read. And then you read the story about how he suffered from an education that was stunted. And you think about the photograph in relation to that, but the photograph doesn't illustrate that in any way. It's one of the least illustrative of all the photographs in the book. It's monumental in a way, the silhouette, but it's not illustrative. There's nothing anecdotal about it. This one is interesting, Ismail Hendricks' photograph as well, I found, because again, I'm very interested in reading shadows. I'm interested in thinking about what shadows do to produce a certain kind of fragmenting of a visual space. Here the shadows are not only cast on the wall, but are cast on the figure himself. The shadow, the silhouette of the figure from profile gives us a kind of double view. Very hard to read into his story or himself. Instead, you just get this sense of a kind of situatedness. But there's another portrait of this man, which you see over here as well, where he's situated in a landscape, a very particular landscape. And if you look at the label, it says Ismail Hendricks at the site where his brother was killed. So the minute you have the label, that over-determines the reading in a certain way, because that doesn't anymore just become a site of gravel and telephone wires or electrical pylons or whatever they are. That becomes a site of memory, that becomes this site of violence, of loss, and of a kind of the framing motif really of his story. So what kind of information is given in alongside photographs, provide these extremely important mediations, which I think are interesting. So I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the photographs within photographs that are in the books, because in addition to these portraits, we have some very wonderful additional mediations of photographs that people own, that the subjects of these stories own, and which they transmit to us. So in addition to Abeda Stoffberg's own portrait of herself and herself in front of her house, we have these 3 photographs where we see the hand holding the photographs from the family album. And the family album is an incredibly important repository of memory and photographic knowledge. It produces knowledge. And here, so we have these small photographs of family members, but just as powerful as the photographs of family members is the gesture of the hand, the tactile gesture of the hand that holds the photograph within the bigger photograph. So that photographs are objects, not just images. They appear to us as things that can be handed out, that can be held, that can be they're almost relics in some situations as well, depending on how we use them. One can kiss them, one can hold them, one can exchange them, one passes them around, and in each one of those physical, tangible mediations, their meaning becomes shifted in terms of the kinds of circulation that we subject them to. And if you look at these photographs within the photographs, the records of the damage they themselves have experienced as objects in the world is also in place there. So that sense of, whether you clean up a photograph or whether you use it as a piece of material culture, which in its very physicality holds its own history, is something that I think is very important. This is the kind of work that, so those of you who know the work of Santu Mofokeng in Black Photo Album, there has been a lot of art practice that looks at archival practices and the mediations and materialities of archive as the substance of art. So not only what images produce, but what these are as objects and the meanings they have as they circulate. And we were talking earlier about the feeling that enabled to tell one's story, the other, and how one's body is an archive, but one's home is also an archive, and the things, the treasured things around us are also extremely important repositories of storytelling and memory in a kind of material enactment, not necessarily in a kind of narrative form, although there might be prompts to narrative. The same is true of Antoinette Daniels, for example. I was interested in the photographs that accompany her portrait, where you see the lives that photographs live, and these are things to which we can all relate. How we frame things, where we put them, where we keep them, how ordinary life is a life which is imbricated by photography and image making, never more so than in our own time now, when everyone is a photographer and on Instagram, etc. But these images reference material culture of earlier times when photographs, situate us in relation to our own past and our histories. And there were other very extraordinary mediations. For example, in the story told by Sonwaba Fasi, who joined, I think it was the PAC, and who died. And his photograph here, he died in 2018, is very, very carefully mediated in a memorial poster. We see it in this context, but then you see it also appearing again in an album, scattered, used in the family environment, and having a very, very different way of producing meaning when it's situated in this kind of a context. And here you see again the hand that holds the photograph within the photograph. The television screen is another technology for the purveying of imagery and photographs. All these layers within layers we can unpack from these photographs, which add to and adumbrate and flesh out and complicate and sometimes trouble the very personal narratives that the text might give us. Dutoy was one of the figures who was brought up earlier. He's the old man who talks about having been sent away to school and having difficulty with language. And he also has one of his photographs of a child from the 1940s on the farm. So that also referenced the sense of people's personal archives and albums. And I think that's one of the projects that Santa Mofokeng has been involved with, but which many people are involved with, is what it is to treasure and to keep those kinds of memories. I've had lots of very, very interesting conversations with Lonnie Bunch, who's now just been appointed the director of all the Smithsonian Museum, but he was the founding director of the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. And he started off his museum with 0 objects. It's this extraordinary building on, some of you might know this project. The project now has 30,000 objects. And they are objects that are garnered from individuals who have treasured things, whether it is the metal wallet in which the freed enslaved person kept their freedom pass, or whether it was a piece of quilting that some woman in Virginia kept, or whether it was a photograph that somebody kept under the bed. This gathering in of the objects, the memorabilia of ordinary life, ordinary survival, ordinary sustenance under duress are extremely important repositories, powerful totems of survival and meaning in unbelievably difficult circumstances. And I mean, I've learned a lot from Lonnie Bunch in terms of what it is to value that kind of material culture and to find places to share and to use them as the prompts for storytelling. So some of the others, when you go back to Ridwan Sali, for example, as I was saying, that photograph didn't tell us very much, but it was juxtaposed with a photograph from the newspaper, which actually situated his story in relation to the kind of photojournalism and reportage that photography also serves. So again, with photography, you're dealing with many, and as you are with language and text, the many different iterations within which a technology can have multiple lives. So what it is to make a photograph in relation to a project like this may use a camera, may involve shooting, but has a very, very different kind of life than, say, a documentary or piece of photojournalism. But having this juxtaposition creates a kind of fleshed out landscape, an ecology of image making, which helps us to read the situatedness and the situation of the characters that inhabit this book. Same, another example here, where of course you have a poster which, and this is a prized image of Tembeka Toleni, so she brings this image into visibility in juxtaposition with her current photograph. And I was very interested in the sewing machine that she chose to have herself represented with. Obviously very important, doesn't enter into the verbal narrative, but tells us something about the life that this woman lives now and the life that helped to construct her own sense of identity in relation to her affiliation with women and with women's struggles and with the liberation struggle through a certain feminist filter that you see in the Ambakakhle poster. Okay, I'm going to, I know that I want there to be time for other people to say things, so I'm going to just move through quite quickly. With Nicholas Meninzi.
Not too quickly.
Not too quickly, okay, well, yeah, I mean, there's lots to say about lots of the images, so yeah, if you stop me when you feel that it's enough already. But this was the very interesting juxtaposition, because I was, of course, making up here my own story about this man and his hands, which you may or may not find convincing. But of course, in the book, the mediations are very interesting, because we have the story that we've heard about already, about Tolile, who is shot and killed alongside him. But we also have the photograph of the memorial mosaic, which exists now, to his friend. And this juxtaposition was obviously a very important one. So this is a photograph of a memorial, of a moment which has been formative in the life of this man and the burden of with which he has lived all his life. But here we have different kinds of representational systems that mediate these to us, which I think is really interesting. So what I would say about photography is that it is a knowledge-producing system, and that it allows us, as all forms of representation, to think with a different kind of language, and to think with new languages, and we cannot collapse one representational system, one kind of language, into another. We have to think that each representational system, I mean, similarly for those of you who are into music, about which I know very little, you know, if I get stuck on the lyrics of something, that's fine, I've got stuck with the lyrics. But if I know nothing about the musical structure from which that piece was culled, what informed it, what produced it, what instruments provided it, what history it taps into. Does it tap into this or that or the other story or culture or moment? Which hybrid instrumentalizations does it bring into being? I will be reading something, but I've got the lyrics. And that's often what happens with photographs, is that people think of them iconically. They get the reading because that's something that's accessible to all of us. But like every representational system, it comes with such complex histories. And the more we understand what those histories are, the more we can open ourselves up to thinking about the multiple, contradictory, and complex ways in which they generate meaning. So I would make a plea for that and say what I think is the strength of the book, and what I would even have wanted to draw out even more was the capacity for the photographs to really provide different, new and alternative forms of knowledge of understanding the situatedness of people and lived experience. So that for me is, I gained hugely from thinking with the book in relation to those questions. Now, this is one of the most searing stories, and we've talked about it already a little. The story of Makubalo, who was shot and still lives with the 17 bullet wounds, or residues of bullet, lodged in his brain. And I looked at this amazing montage, really, of photographs, and thought about what they might teach us about photography as a complicated and contested representational set of structures. So on the one hand, you have this beautiful portrait. As you said earlier, it's hard to look at it because one has to confront the visible wound on the face, the site of trauma, which is here physically articulated and which takes us right the way back to the origins of what trauma is. It's a wound to the body, but it's one which can manifest itself in all sorts of ways that are both corporeal and beyond the body. So we have that. We also have, I think, a very beautiful environment. I'm looking at the image on the right. I'm sorry it's so washed out there. The curtained environment, the armchair, the stance of the man, the cardigan he wears, the curtains behind him, the texture of the cloth, and the play of the light. There is a lot in that photograph, and when you look at it in the book, you'll see it a lot more clearly because it's so much more intense. But juxtaposed with that, you have a different kind of photography completely, which is X-ray photography. And X-ray photography has a whole different life in terms of the medicalization of human bodies and the kinds of forensic evidence that X-ray photographs can give us. There's a lot of work on forensics now. There's all sorts of stuff. Everybody's quite besotted with forensics because of the way in which forensics can give us evidence of what happens in situations where things seem to be occluded. And there's a whole outfit. Some of you might have followed forensic architecture, the work of A.L. Weitzman, yes, who's done all this work in Israel-Palestine, looking at the way in which bullet holes in walls help us to reconstruct stories of violence and violation. Forensics is a big thing in photography. But forensics, it seems to me, is crucial and interesting, but can only take us so far. Because often the evidence that is there in the forensic representation cannot speak of affect, cannot speak of memory, cannot speak of loss, cannot speak of all the emotional freight that we have been talking about, or allow us to project and narrate in ways that can be counterintuitive, and sometimes that can go against the grain of the photographic evidence. So in this, here we have a whole panoply of images. We have the forensic radiograph, X-ray graph that shows us the evidence of the scars in the head. But what that X-ray photograph cannot tell us is the cost to that man sitting on the right of having those bullets in the head. It can only function in a certain kind of medical legalistic discourse, and might be crucial in that legalistic discourse because you might need it in a courtroom. So I'm not saying it's not useful, but I'm saying it can only function in a certain way. Or we can repurpose it. And all sorts of conceptual art practitioners might want to take that very X-ray and do something with it. Now you may think that's a travesty. They may colour it over. They may put it on somebody else's image. They might superimpose something. They might cut it up. Some of you might say, hey, that's not theirs to do that with. That's an unethical thing. That's this man's life and his image. But a lot of conceptual art practice and photographic practices use images, repurpose images in that way. So you can see where that might form the material of another kind of critical, self-critical art practice. And then below, that image is really interesting. So here you have this very same person who talks in his narrative of coming in and out of mental health because of his traumatic experience. This is a moment where, to me, I read it with a certain degree of pride. This is a man who points to an image mediated in a newspaper which tells a story that he wants to share. And he takes ownership of that frame to do that. So in this one montage here, you have the capacity of photographic languages to do very, very different and very interesting things. And to me seem extremely productive. We've talked a lot about this photograph already, and this is the very, very painful story of the man who lives with blindness, having been blinded violently. And this raises a whole series of questions. There's a huge theoretical body about photography and blindness. The ethics of photographing people who cannot see goes back to early photographs in America in the 1920s and the 1930s of people photographing people unbeknown to them, blind people selling objects in the streets of New York City. There's been a lot of ethical debate, for example, around Peter Hugo's project, looking at people who, because blindness is a kind of physical articulation, perhaps, of the power structures that are often embedded in photographs, where sight is given to the photographer who photographs the person and sometimes is seen to objectify them. Or, so a blind person is like the ultimate expression of the person not having the capacity to see themselves. They are the ones who are seen. So the ethics of blindness and sight in relation to photographic literature is large. And I was very struck by thinking about that when I was looking at this photograph and thinking about the fact that this individual, so they are beautiful and extraordinary photographs, and there is something radiant, really, about the expression on the face. But this is not an image that he can see. So what does that do to our own understanding of the work that this photograph does? And that may be fine, and he may have agreed to it. I'm not necessarily judging it, but I'm saying that it opens up questions of representation, some of which we've been talking about today, and who has the power to represent and who is represented. The blindness issue really literalizes that as a problematic. I was very taken by the story of Russell Capito, who we haven't talked about yet, because this is also a man who talks in his own story of immeasurable loss and pain, because, and it's etched in a way in his face again, he was a person who, I think he came from Worcester. He fell in love with a person racialized white, classified white, and this love affair went wrong. She decided in the end, after all the hostility from their family, that she could not go through with it, and they met in the church. That's why he's had himself photographed at the church next door. So it's a photograph of a man who lives still haunted by the fact that he could not live with the person he wanted to live with. So that again, it's a very, very powerful story when he tells it. You cannot know that from the photograph. That is not the kind of information you can glean from the photograph. All you can glean from looking at this man's face is that he has lived a life, the suffering of which is etched to some extent on that face. And is it a melancholic face? What is it to think? Can we think of melancholia as something that is a property, a physical, corporeal property, or is it an abstraction always? And to what extent can we think about melancholia? Of course, Dürer, the great German printmaker, did the figuration of melancholia as an old woman. So there are ways in which art can provide a space of healing and can provide a space of therapy. Or in some ways reparation and repair can make better the damage and the harm of the past. And it's a concept that I have huge amounts of difficulty with. Not because I don't want people to be healed. I mean, you know, of course one wants the alleviation of suffering. But I worry at the instrumentalization of art to provide that kind of function. Because art then has really to become at the service of something which is so enormous and so big, and which it ends up often failing at because it's not something you can ask of art that it should do. So this is not to say that there aren't various kinds of therapeutic practices, whether it's through drama or you know, recounting our own life stories, or touching one another in profound ways, both physically and psychologically, or making things together. I'm not against that idea, but I think we have to keep a separation between what we might want to call phototherapy, or drama therapy, or music therapy, or dance therapy, all of which are very, very important mediums that go beyond the linguistic for mutual encounter. But there is also another space, which is the critical space of art making, which can't make the world better, I think, but can provide us for a space of providing a language for reflecting upon the world, and thinking about the world, and producing new and different knowledge. And it doesn't necessarily make it better. It's a different function. So I like to separate out the therapeutic mediums that we might want to use in all sorts of different environments, and I do not denigrate them, from what I see also as a very, very important role that art must have, which is to ask new questions and to make new languages, and allow us to think in new languages. So I thought of two art therapy type projects that are not in this book that you might want to think of as contrasts. So many of you may know the Gideon Mendel project on framing AIDS, where he worked with photographic techniques and storytelling with communities through the 2000s in order to provide a space through which people represent themselves, their own stories, in images and in photographs. And that would be a certain kind of phototherapy, instrumentalization of photographic technology to produce certain kinds of work within a community. Another project, a very important project in the United Kingdom, some of you may know the work of Jo Spence. Jo Spence was an extraordinary woman who actually invented a whole a school of phototherapeutic work. This is a book, putting myself in the picture. A woman from a working class background who in the 1980s was diagnosed with breast cancer. I tried to get some of the images off Google Images, but they wouldn't let me cut and paste them here, so do go and look at them. She documented her whole experience of breast cancer, her mastectomy, and what happens to her body, and worked with communities of women, working class women and other women, to look at what happens to the body and to use photography in those encounters as a therapeutic tool. So these are projects, these are projects that I think are very interesting. They did produce new languages, particularly I think Jo Spence was extremely formative as inventing and rethinking photographic language in this way. And even though in the 80s when she produced this, all the sort of avant-garde art theorists and critics were not taking it terribly seriously. Now, in retrospect, people are, she's dead now, she died. Now people are looking at it and thinking about whether this line that I have drawn and have thrown out here between phototherapeutic practices and art practices is something that you want to keep or not. Mm-hmm. So I throw it open as a proposition. I'm invested in it, but I'm open to being challenged on it. And Jo Spence's project is one of the ones that challenges me on it. So just to finish off, I just wanted to finish off with some of the very, very compelling portraits, and particularly this portrait. There's also another one with 4 figures, but what I loved about this portrait, I mean, I think it's an amazing portrait because of the the way that the face is framed, the monumentality of that face against this, the background which is made to be very, very hazy, so that we concentrate and we focus in on the face and all that we can read in the face. But I was struck too when I was looking this morning at the cover of the book, because this is the same woman. And here she hides her face. And I looked at it when one of you was holding it up and I thought, is it the same one? Yes, it's the same turban. And then I was thinking that this is a very interesting way to end and to think about the ethics of exposure. Because in this photograph, this is a person who hides her face. She refuses to show her face to whoever is photographing her. And it's the photograph that you've used on the cover, and I think it's the perfect photograph for the cover. These are the things that sit with us, sits on top of that. And one of the things that sits with us is questions around the ethics of exposure. What is it to expose the face? So inadvertently, and I'm sure you didn't intend this, you have asked a question of us about the ethics of exposure, both in narrative and in terms of image making, that the book wants us to address, and I thank you for that. Rhetorical device in classical theory of ekphrasis, which is putting pictures into words. And the minute you're in an ekphrastic process, you are in an interpretive process, and there is no such thing as a neutral or objective process of. It's a process of translation, this thing of pictures into words. So my suggestion to you is to say that there are other forms of encounter with these photographs. Whether we can ever escape language and the discursive, I don't know. But I would love to see, for example, a group of art students respond to these photographs or through visual means. So what might it be, and I think this would be a brilliant project, to go into an art school go to Michaelis or go to Stellenbosch Art School, and to ask a group of students, third-year students or MA students or whatever, to make work that responds to these images. And then to see whether, out of a different kind of formal languages, it could be, you could do it in clay, you could do it in new kinds of photographs, but what would it be to encounter these in different kinds of languages? I'm not saying you can escape the prison house of language, because even those practices are themselves, we live in language. We live all the time in a process of naming. And even our corporeal, the evidence that's etched on our body is then in some way understood through language. So it's not that we can escape language, but I think that we can channel ways of knowing through different kinds of media. And it would be wonderful to see this responded to in those sorts of ways. So I think that just would be very, very productive. Yeah, I mean, it is, the questions of representation and intersubjectivity are hugely complex. And I think the productive and interesting thing about this book is that it challenges us to think about those questions of representation and intersubjectivity. Not that it has the answers, and some people will think that, it does too much of this or too much of that, or some people think they should have put the images separately because that would have allowed you to give them a certain autonomy. Others would have found that extremely frustrating because they've said, I'm going backwards and forwards all the time and this is driving me nuts, why didn't you put the pictures next to them? Whatever you're going to do, you are going to mediate the experience and you're going to produce a certain reading practice. And a reading practice is an interpretive practice and a physical practice. So yes, you make your choices and then you deal with whatever consequences that produces. But I think that it's an object that can prompt other kinds of objects and other forms of narration and being, and that is what it needs to do. So that's just to think about those questions. I'm not sure how to respond. Oh yes, in terms of the vulnerability, the corporeal vulnerability of the figures within who chooses to be photographed, who doesn't. these are ethical questions that beset us all the time in looking at these images. And they can't help but make one feel uncomfortable. And maybe that's to do with the structures of power in which we all live, of publishing, of the academy, of the sorts of things we were talking about earlier, about ownership on those stories, about even if one takes them back to the communities where these books reside, how they circulate, how they get owned. These are inevitable because they're part of the social fabric which has constructed us. And inescapable. I don't know how one escapes them, except insofar as one can be honest in trying to address them. In terms of this juxtaposition, what I find very interesting, because as a historian of documentary practices in South Africa, I immediately recognize that as a George Hallett photograph on the right. So George Hallett was a Durban-based documentary photographer who was one of the figures who produced the apartheid archive. Did very, very interesting and extraordinary black and white photographs during the apartheid years, which document daily life. During the apartheid years. And he's very interesting, a bit like Santa Mofokeng and many of the photographers of the apartheid era, is that, this is one of the things that Njabela Ndabule has said in his critique of the spectacularization of the violence of South African life under apartheid. The archive, the apartheid archive, and particularly that which was then associated with the Bang Bang Club in the 90s or with Afropix, and a certain kind of necessary, dramatic representation of life in apartheid South Africa. Often, Santa Mofokeng has said he got sick of chasing ambulances and seeing black blood and having to be there all the time to document the dramatic incidents of apartheid. And what he wanted to do was to photograph the interstices of daily life. Like his Train Church series, some of you may know this. How do people make life out of that commute, where they have to go at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning from here to there? Well, often, the train becomes a church, the walls become drums, the singing that ensues. What is it to photograph the spaces through which people creatively and resiliently make meaning out of life? How do you put that in an image? Not a story where you're telling a story. How do you encapsulate the resilience of daily life in an image and not just end up as an ambulance chaser? That was Mofokeng has written about and talked about, over the years. And Hallett as well is one of them. Now both of them did their time on the front line. It's not that they didn't photograph the 76 riots, and these were very important photographs because they went round the world. These were the photographs that furnished the anti-apartheid movement with its archive of visual images, which helped to produce the kind of campaigns globally of cultural boycotts, etc. So that archive is very, very important. But what people like Mofokeng and Hallett have said is that that is not the whole of the apartheid archive. The archive also has to consist of the stories of daily life and the meaning that people make out of their lives. So I look at this, and it's a little bit like what you were saying. Here is this woman who obviously sang. She prided herself on the fact that she sang, she made music in that time. And it's juxtaposed in this book with a documentary black and white photograph by George Hallett, which has to be understood in terms of this whole other history of photography, about which there's all sorts of debate. It's not an uncontested history, and even the way I've just characterized it, in terms of the Mofokeng dichotomy, that itself is not an uncontested